thanks for joining me. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're all energized after lunch. My name is Florence Aretz. I'm an investment director at Adevinta Ventures. And we're going to spend the next 30 minutes talking about work, about flexibility and about work. Let me first begin by telling you a few words about Adevinta. So Adevinta, as you've just heard, is a global leader in online marketplaces. We operate classifieds across 16 markets. As you've heard, some of our brands might be familiar to you. These are Le Bon Coin in France, Spock here in Germany or in the UK, Subito in Italy, or InfoJobs, the leading job portal in Spain. We were previously known as Schibsted Marketplaces, so we got spun off back in April. We are listed in Oslo. We have a $7 billion market cap and about 700 million euros in revenues every year. I specifically work for our venture arm, Adevinta Ventures. Adevinta Ventures was set up about 2 years ago with the goal to invest in the next wave of marketplaces. We are focused on early stage marketplaces within real estate, mobility. Is that working okay? Yeah. Sorry. Investing in real estate, mobility, and recruitment. We're typically focused on Series A and Series B. What differentiates us from other investors is that we're corporate, and as a result, we help our portfolio companies with more than financial resources, be it through our presence in 16 markets, or traffic, users, or sheer market knowledge, local market knowledge. Now, I've chosen today to talk about jobs because I genuinely believe this is an exciting space and one that is actually not that well covered. A year ago, I had the chance to stand in front of you, or some of you already, with Johan Weingart, who's the founder of Dealroom.co. Dealroom is a leading provider of data to the venture capital industry, and together... Okay, thanks. And together, So together, a year ago, we had published already a report on the future of marketplaces, and that was featuring funding data across sectors. We will publish a follow-up to that piece later in January 2020, but I wanted to give you a snippet of it. As you can see on the left-hand side, funding into marketplaces have known widely different realities depending on the sector you look at. Essentially, mobility and fintech have gathered as much as $100 billion so far in VC investment since 2013. And I think that's essentially reflect a new reality. Uber and Lyft have demonstrated that you'd be happy to share a ride with a total stranger. And likewise in fintech, the European landscape has been particularly favorable to the emergence of neobanks. Conversely, jobs and education rank at the very bottom of this chart. That means that it's received relatively little interest or little funding, at least so far. Looking at the value created, which by Dealroom definition is theoretical value, whether an exit has materialized or not, it's showing you a different picture. Well, the first one is that if you invested in travel, you're probably better off than if you invested in mobility or fintech, at least so far. And to me, this overall reflects the fact that, yes, jobs and education are two sectors that are essentially, we're only scratching the surface of those. If not underinvested, at least I do believe that there is huge opportunity in deepening our exposure to those. And now, I've specifically chosen to talk about flexibility because I genuinely believe that today workers have started to perceive and engage with work differently than before. Whatever you think of it, Uber has redefined the relationship between employers and employees. Flexibility came as a need from the corporates to keep costs low. That's a fact. But as you can see from behind me, the narrative that Glovo, Uber, or Lyft are using in their recruitment campaigns is not a negative one. It's actually, hey, you can be your own boss. You can stop working 9 to 5, and you can be master of your own destiny. And this is really important because today 40% of the workforce in the EU is engaged in non-classic form of employment. That means freelancing, interim, on-demand type of work. In fact, in France, the number of freelancers has doubled in the past 10 years, admittedly from a low base, but still 800,000 people are freelancers in France today. And in Spain, you have close to 20% of the workforce that engages with digital platforms like those on a weekly basis. So flexibility is a reality, and we just need to understand why. And I think there are two fundamental factors. The first one is this. So I've allowed myself to quote Roy Bahat from Bloomberg Ventures. Bloomberg Ventures is a corporate VC that operates in the US, essentially the corporate VC arm of Bloomberg, and they're specialized in the future of work. And Rory and his team, they spent a tremendous amount of time trying to understand what do people actually want. And what they tell us is that, workers want one thing, they want stability. In fact, they want a stable earning. There is no such thing as freedom or the search for meaning, at least not until you're earning already a comfortable salary. That's what this means. And yet, what he also tells us is that less than half of American people actually manage to live comfortably on their salary. And so there is another element to keep into account here. The whole second half of the 20th century has been built on steady income, on having an undefined contract with a company. You'd get a job, you'd get married, you'd get a home, you'd get a mortgage, you'd get access to consumption and to credit. This is something that someone called Laetitia Vito in France has widely described, and she writes in English as well if you're interested in that topic, but essentially it's the broken promise. Why would you trade your autonomy and your creativity if you're not guaranteed protection anymore? Why? Because, globalization is happening, jobs have been cut, unions are very weak. I think it's hard to, not to see the fact that the protection that maybe our parents used to have is no longer a reality. And this is driver number one behind flexibility. The second element is the end of linear careers. Essentially, there is no such thing as a linear career anymore. 65% of Americans have a positive view of job hopping. And if you talk to people below 35, 75% of them actually think that's going to help their career. In other words, uncertainty and changing job and changing career or changing job along the way is no longer seen as an issue, it's a feature. So our relationship to uncertainty or appreciation of uncertainty has totally changed. Again, a couple of reasons for that. The first one is that education, like many sectors, is digitized. You can get anything, anywhere, on demand. There are less and less local specificities with the education market, which is fueling the rise of for self-development, for reskilling, and we'll come back to that. The second aspect is something you've probably heard a lot about. It's simply technological changes. The fact that the job that my daughter will have in 20 years' time probably doesn't exist yet, and that we need to keep up with changing technologies and readapt ourselves. The third aspect is the economic reasons. The average graduate in the US starts his career or their career with a 60K debt, and that's a major factor in them switching jobs. That's already pretty much the case in Asia. I think it's a fair assumption to imagine that this could be the case in Europe at some point as well. Now, I hope you get the big picture on why flexibility is now a very prominent feature in the job market. That's not only something that people suffer of, but sometimes that's something that people actually choose. And I wanted, whether you're an investor or you're working for a marketplace, I wanted to drill into 3 areas that I think are really important today in our space. The first one is probably the most obvious one, which is that on-demand marketplaces have popped up all over the place, whether it's in the blue-collar side or white-collar. Flexible on-demand contracts can be found in all types of incomes, all types of tasks. So on the left-hand side, you'll have the blue-collar jobs, pretty homogeneous by nature. The marketplace optimizes pricing and liquidity. People deliver their job. I see two challenges here. The first one is that in order to master, as you go into services or delivering services, I think the marketplace has to be inherently closer to the person delivering the service, meaning monitoring what they do, when, how. And I think that was at the very core the success of Deliveroo, pushing notifications to the people doing the deliveries to make sure they be on time and won't take breaks. I think that's an issue, not from a moral perspective, but from a legal perspective. At a time when more and more of those contracts, freelancers' contracts, are being requalified, it's important for those marketplaces to have a clear, clear distance to how they engage with their workers, and at the same time, it's an inherent feature of those models. So, challenge number one. Challenge number two is that most of those guys would operate in high turnover industries. If you'd put me in a restaurant, I don't think I'd last more than a day. Essentially because I'm not patient enough to be client-facing, I think. But essentially what I mean by this is that turnover is a feature in those industries. And CAC, and I think we've heard that already this morning from Lontum and from various presentations, it's a fundamental issue that those models have to address. If you don't have the worker-centric approach, and you're just treating workers as indifferentiated source of supply, can you really, realistically, expect them to stick to you? And here I'd like to quote and to discuss a counterexample, which is that of Medwing. So I've featured a couple of marketplaces here, some really blue collar, some in elderly care, childcare, some even in languages. Medwing is a staffing marketplace for the healthcare sector. So they place nurses with hospitals. They're working today, they're based in Berlin. They're working today with 500 hospitals. They have 100,000 nurses registered on their platform. And they manage to generate 2,000 bookings every month, growing steadily, nicely. Full disclosure, we invested into Medwing. However, the reason why I'm mentioning them is that they've taken an outspoken approach to being nurses first. Nurses are typically women who have families, schedules, and struggle to stay in stable employment. They actually choose flexibility, most of them, as a feature of their career and to accommodate their family and not the other way around. And this is what Medwing is doing. And to me, this is a striking example of a marketplace tackling that challenge. On the white collar side, I think that's really what is new today, is that interim was probably or used to be secluded to kind of, those low-income tasks, undifferentiated tasks. And this is no longer the case. I don't think that this comes without challenge. Essentially today, and Andreessen Horowitz recently published a piece about that called the passion economy, so how you can earn a living from your passion, from your unique skills. This is what these guys are doing. I think the challenge here is an interesting one, and one very much worth monitoring. The likes of Malt and Upwork and so on still have very tiny share, however successful they are, and they are, still have a very tiny share of their market. Why? Because gradually you're touching to jobs that are historically based on trust and relationship and lasting trust. And I think the next challenge and the next interesting development in those areas will be how those guys are able to develop B2B sales, able to convert corporates to using platforms as opposed to the Capgemini of this world. That's the next challenge in that space, and I think that's a very exciting one to monitor. The second element I'd like to drill into is that of reskilling. Because I think that in the current environment, education and training has become a natural expansion of recruitment. If there is one thing you need to take away from this presentation, is that investing in the job sector goes, I think, beyond recruitment. At least that's a fundamental view that we have. It all started with online course providers, so I can quote you, for instance, Coursera. But gradually, you've seen an array of players coming in, whether offline, like bootcamps, or online, like Lambda School. And you're probably thinking, why the hell is she talking about bootcamps? That's totally non-tech. And that kind of be with you, but I think that the truth will lie in between in the near future. First, because in the US, if you look at the US, the bootcamp landscape, after a massive wave of expansion, has started to consolidate. And I think we will see that gradually happening in Europe. If I quote two examples from Europe, I really think you have opportunities for those players to close the gap in some specific sectors with high gaps in demand and offers, such as IT, tech, sales, for instance. So thinking about two players that are doing that, one for profit, the other one non-for-profit. One is, for instance, Ironac, which is basically the biggest bootcamp in Europe. They operate in 9 locations, 3 outside of Europe, for instance. And they've been a good example of this ability to expand your curriculum and expand geographically, which is not easy. Non-for-profit example would be l'École 42, the School 42, in English, which was set up by Xavier Niel, big tech tycoon from France, heavily investing in the next wave of tech coming. And essentially he's opened a school for young people to learn how to code. Interesting development. The school recently removed the age limit of 30 years old, is expanding to 20 campuses, and is now expanding to more courses like project management and so on. Again, to me, it signals that there is an opportunity for players to start integrating training in order to address certain gaps in the job market, and that's a very interesting development. Now, I also mentioned online training, because this can be also done online, and you have a fantastic example in the US called Lambda School, which is essentially a coding skill, engaging coding course that differentiates itself by delivering financing agreement with the students. So it's free for students, and they only pay based on the salary they will get. In other words, they're aligning the interests of the students with that of the companies. To be fair, Lambda School has started to open campuses, or not campuses, but at least they're starting to offer accommodation for their students. And I think this is a signal that in the end, you need some kind of peer support when you're studying. So that's why I really believe that the future in education will be in between online and offline, not just one or the other. But it's a super interesting space to watch out for. The third aspect I would like to drill into is that of retention. The same way you think about CAC and LTV for any marketplace, I think that the interesting development is that companies are starting to think about CAC and LTV. If instead of spending so much money on recruiting people, we were spending on retaining them over time, wouldn't that make life easier? So the average job tenure, as we said earlier, is already coming down in the US, but essentially that's a global, or at least a Western trend. And so I think there are like 3 aspects that's come up recently that really illustrate this need for companies to start questioning their retention and what they're actually doing. One is coaching, the other employee satisfaction, the third one, employee perks. Coaching can take many forms, be peer-to-peer, can be hard skills, soft skills, or B2C. You have plenty of models, and if you're interested in that topic, I would refer you to a recent analysis done by a Paris-based fund called Brightsize, who've done extensive research on that space. The other aspect would be employee satisfaction. How do you take the pulse of your employees? You've had an array of models coming into that space. Glint in the US, Peakon in Europe. I can name you quite a few. They kind of differ by who they engage with, whether it's top management, HR, the middle managers, and so on. The third aspect would be employee perks. I don't think you've seen any job ad recently that didn't feature, hey, we have free X and Y, filled with food or gym or whatever. But essentially, what this shows you, that companies are starting to question their ability to retain people over time. I'm on purpose asking whether it will last, because we have to accept that we're in a very peculiar job market as well, with some gaps in demand and offers, some real struggle to retain people. If the macro turns, whether it's in 6 or 12 months' time, I think the market at the moment, investors are quite polarized on whether you want to play this or not. And that depends on your view on whether this will last or not. So, as we've seen, flexibility has become a feature of the job market. And this is affecting business models and tech business models in many ways. But I think that an interesting and fascinating part of this industry is that actually, it's not just about the needs of workers not being met and the opportunity that we're not tackling yet. I think what I really like about this is also that this space, recruitment, education, has far-reaching consequences on society and politics at large. And I'm not actually sure we totally gather that yet. If you think that, as I've said, throughout the 20th century, your stable income was the basis of your protection, this is what we're gradually losing. Basic protection rights for workers, or basic insurance if you want. And let me be clear, I do not know whether the answer will come from the political world or the economy or from tech. I guess you will have different answers depending on where you come from and where you've worked, actually. What is for sure is that the political world has answers to bring on pension and unemployment, and you have a lot of regulation changing today on freelancers and freelancers contracts across the globe. Overall, there are, I think, many more aspects that relate to work that are only just emerging. And this can relate to tax and finance. How do you bank when you're a freelancer? Do you have specific needs? To housing. So as I said, if I can't get a mortgage because I'm a freelancer or I can't rent, how do I do? We also invested in a company called Flatfare that enables deposit-free rentals in the UK. But next to it, I'm featuring an insurance product, and I can quote you like 4 or 5 insurance products that exist just in France to solve the fact that there is no such thing as trust between landlords and tenants anymore, and even less so because people don't have fixed contracts. I mean, 90% of contracts created in France today are non-permanent, flexible ones. How do you solve that for people? And the same goes with insurance, health insurance. How do you provide that to people that are actually outside of the normal corporate scope? So I hope that this presentation has really brought you those ideas. That one, flexibility is really redefining job and the job space. That there are many more investments to come in that space, and I hope so at least. And second, that is a space that brings up issues for society at large. If you do have solutions for those, do reach out on Adevinta Ventures. I'd be happy to talk about it with you. Thank you.